Cloud. All right, done.
Okay. And I used that little break to pick up my pen, which I dropped. So, okay, we're recording now. Hello. So if we look at Judaism, it clearly has a quite strong particularistic element to it. The faith is not universalistic like Christianity and Islam. It's linked to a particular tribe, a particular family, the descendants of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, formed the people, the children of Israel, the Klal Yisrael, Bnei Yisrael, and that's how we define Jews to this day. Someone who is born as a Jew remains a Jew and is part of the covenantal partners with God, whether they choose to be or not. And in that sense, it has a strong family and national identity. Now, it is true that it is open to converts, meaning that the ethnicity is modified somewhat. Genetic research suggests that this probably hovered somewhere around 1% per generation. But nonetheless, this is a relatively trivial access. As is well known, we don't really go around proselytizing, we don't go around encouraging conversion particularly, and certainly that's been the case in the Jewish world for at least 2,000 years. We are open to accepting converts when they wish to join the Jewish people, but even then, note that they don't just join the religion of Judaism, but they also join the people of Judaism. So they, in a sense, become immigrants to the national identity of Judaism. It isn't a pan-national faith. It's a faith where the national identity of its followers are important, as opposed to Christianity and Islam, where these are multinational faiths. One can be French or Polish or Brazilian and members of the Christian faith or the Muslim faith. So in that sense, it's very particularistic. On the other hand, it definitely has strong universalistic elements to it, both in terms of how it sees things currently and certainly in terms of the end goal. So how does it see things currently? Well, it sees genuine relationship with God as open to all human beings. It sees all human beings as created in the image of God. Indeed, the very beautiful Mishnah tells us, Lomam nivra adam yechidi. Why was a human being created alone? And the answer is that no person can say, my ancestor is greater than your ancestor. We're all descendants of Adam and Eve. Similarly, the Mishnah tells us, all human beings are beloved by God because we're all created in the image of God. So in that sense, the classical sources are universalistic. The verse tells us, referring even to the temple, which one thinks of as the center of ritual and the center of particular Jewish life, it's described in the Pasuk as ki beiti, my home, my bayit, God says, beit tefilahi l'chol ha'amim. It is a home, a house of prayer for all peoples. It's not just a place of worship for the Jewish people, it's a place of worship for all human beings. More than that, we believe that all human beings can aspire to genuine spirituality, to prophecy even, they're Jewish prophets and there are non-Jewish prophets, and to the ultimate close relationship with God, which we refer to as a portion in the world to come, whatever exactly that means. We've discussed, I think, the very first time I met this group, I think we discussed a little bit about the world to come, separate topic that needs analysis, but all human beings can have a portion in the world to come, and the demands placed upon non-Jews are, in a sense, relatively minimal. One has to accept the 7 Noachide commandments, which really add up to not much more than being a decent human being, avoidance of murder, acceptance of a justice system, and things like that. So in that sense, even now in its current model, it has universalistic tendencies and aspects. And when we look to the future, it's called astrology in astrological goals, the ultimate end goal of the Messianic dream. There certainly, it has a very universalistic element to it. We talk about all nations of the world ending up as partnering with Jewish people in the service of God. And this is, for example, a very dominant theme in the prayers of the High Holy Days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, when really the central plank of the Amidah speaks about the whole world getting to recognize God and building a relationship with him. We take as our Haftarah on Mincha on Yom Kippur the story of Jonah with his mission being sent to Nineveh. Perhaps when we read the story, we don't understand how almost subversive the story is. Nineveh is the capital of Assyria. Assyria is the local empire threatening Israel at the time. And you have this Jewish prophet being sent by God to tell Nineveh to get its moral act together, otherwise it will be destroyed. And Nineveh is saved. Saved for what? Saved to give rise to Sancherev, who then goes and conquers half of the land of Israel and sends them into exile. So it's an absolutely remarkable story. And the story finds its way into one of the most moving and intense and central moments of the Yom Kippur service, the Mincha service, with this message of a sort of universal care. The story is of Yonah being reluctant to take his mission, to do his mission, and God saying to him, you need to care about all human life. All human life is precious to me. So this is absolutely central. So one has this sort of tension in Judaism between this universalistic and particularistic elements to it, which we now need to unpick a little bit and struggle to understand what is this strange and weird combination. And actually, here maybe I'm speaking for myself, but I think this is possibly shared by other people also. It's often quite difficult to struggle with the particularistic elements of Judaism. And by that I mean the focus on Jews as a people and a nation, but also the very nature of God. When we talk about belief in a relationship to spirituality, I think many of us here would share the sentiment that, look, we live in a material world, a world in which clearly the laws of physics and science dominate, and yet we can relate to the idea that there's something more to the world than just the physical universe that we inhabit in. I think very few people find a sort of very materialistic view and a very reductionist view of life as meaningful. I think we all understand that as humans, we search for meaning and value, and we aspire for spirituality, for connection with something that's beyond. And out of that arises the most basic sentiment of religiosity that I think many thinking human beings experience. There's a purpose, there's a value, there's morality, there's spirituality, there's something we're meant to achieve. Where things get difficult is when we then look in the Torah. And rather than this sort of very universalistic, abstract God, we have a God that is very, I mean, he's a person. By that I don't mean he's a human being. He's not a human being, but he has a personality. He wants to form connections with humans. He forms relationships with human beings, certain types of human beings. It's true, good human beings, but he wants that connection with them. He engages with them. He sometimes gets angry with them. He loves them. He cares for them. He protects them. Sometimes he punishes them. And he seems to care about all sorts of human behavior, some of which is very significant: war and justice and charity and love, and then also nitty-gritty. I mean, he cares about whether we switch lights on and off on Shabbat, and he cares about what we get up to in really personal relationships and personal marital life. He cares about where we live. He seems to think that there's a holy land and a place where we should live and a place where we can have unique relationships. He has connections with particular families, and this is where it all gets a little tough and a little bit strange. What's this business with this very personal God who wants this sort of intimate connection with human beings, and he seems to get very nitty-gritty. And the level of complexity and detail in Jewish law is shocking. I mean, it's just remarkable. Charity is important. Let's have a little conversation about the importance of charity. It looks after people more vulnerable to us, more vulnerable than us, and we care for those who are poor. And let's all go and give charity. But that's not where it stops. We then develop an extensive code of how to give charity and who to prioritize and how much to give and what the best way to give it is and who one should give to and how one should give, and before you know it, you have an extensive halachic literature with all the details of giving, and again it just seems a little bit too detailed for comfort. So there's this tension there between this abstract idealistic God, and there's definitely elements of that in Jewish thinking. We talk about Hakel, Hagodol, Hagibah, Vanora, this awesome God. Some of the most beautiful religious poetry written by human beings has been written by Jews. It's an amazing thing. I mean, when you sit there in shul and you sing the verses of Hallel, if one puts a little bit of effort into it, one can work out the meaning. It's not that hard to understand the meaning, and one can ring to the motion of the words. And when we think that these words were written 3,500 years ago by a king in the Middle East, by David the king, David HaMelech, And he realized that 3,500 years on, we can still understand it. And a reasonably educated Jew can read his way through it, completely understand it. An Israeli without any training can understand it and read this text. We struggled to read Shakespeare 500 years ago, but these words from 3,500 years ago we can read, and they still ring. They still arouse in us emotion. They're remarkable, beautiful poetry. So there certainly is that grandeur of spirit in Judaism. You read some of the work of more recent thinkers, the Rambam, and one sees this very profound and intellectual abstract God, and then suddenly we shift mode and we end up with this very personal God. Even in the central prayer of the Amidah, the Shemona Esrei, the silent tefillah that we engage in, we talk about Ge'el HaGadol HaGibor V'Noah, this great and awesome God, and then we say Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov. He's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, of these three wandering desert Jews who lived 3,500 years ago. So there's this constant switch and track between these two gods. By the way, every time you say a blessing, you're switching between these two gods. Every blessing has a paradox, a contradiction built into the very language of the Hebrew used. The blessing always starts off with a second person, with a very close, personal, intimate connection between myself and God. Baruch atah Hashem, we always say, blessed are you, O God. So we start off almost with this image. If one's meditates a little bit as one says a blessing, one is aware of almost standing in front of God and one speaking to him. I'm saying, blessed are you, O God. That's the start of the blessing. And then we shift into the third person. We begin talking about him or it. So we say, for example, one of the most common blessings made on food, Shahakol Niyeh B'Dvaru. Everything came into existence through his word. So we almost immediately distance ourselves and recognize we're speaking about this more aloof and distant being. So even in the very language of the blessing that's made, if we make a blessing in the right way, when it's meant to be a sort of short meditative experience, we shift mode in the blessing itself. The Kabbalists refer to as these two modes of operation as the love mode and the awe mode. Always an old-fashioned way of saying, not quite fear, but always is sort of respect to a figure who is one recognizes in a class of their own, is in a different category and status to oneself. And we shift between love, which is connection, that's the meaning of the word love, is all about connection, and fear or awe, which is about transcendence, a recognition of that which transcends us. And that's reflected in the meditation that we're meant to engage in every time we say a blessing. We're meant to feel Baruch Atah, we're meant to feel this intense sense of connection. And as soon as we feel that intensity, we become aware, who am I connecting to? This infinite God who is beyond really human relationships. And this is the God. We now move into the sort of Maimonidean God, the God of David, the great singer, this sort of above human God, this God who is beyond our little petty human needs and relationships, and therefore we begin speaking about him in the third person. So there's this shift the whole time going on in the very language of Hebrew and the very structure of prayer itself. So again, I ask the question: what are we meant to make of all of this? So the journey I've tried to take us on so far is looking at the question as it was asked: are we universalistic or particularistic? And try to demonstrate that they're both strands in Judaism, and then step back a little bit and look at this more broadly and realize that in a sense there's these two gods, these two aspects of God that we relate to. There's the very immanent God, the God who's very present in our life, who we carry with us in our heart, who we live with, who we feel a sense of love and a sense of connection to. And then there's the God who is transcendent, the sort of philosophical God, who is above really human relationships. We have an immanent God who wants to form a connection with us as people, who chooses a people, who loves Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's family, he's part of the family. He's a God who's just there and present in our lives. And then there's the other God who is the grand creator of the world and above, in a sense, our own unique national needs. By the way, the same dichotomy is reflected in the calendar of the Jewish year. We have three central festivals in the Jewish year, along with the days of repentance. These are Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, which are the three festivals. They're referred to as the Shalosh Regalim, three festivals. And then we have Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. There's Purim and Hanukkah, which are later festivals relating to events that took place relatively recently in Jewish history, a couple of thousand years ago. The core biblical festivals are Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. Now, what do they commemorate? So the truth is they have exactly the same dual theme. They are both national festivals and global festivals. They're national festivals because they reflect our own personal Jewish story. I mean, what happened on Pesach? We left Egypt. That's a story, a personal story of a particular nation, a particular Jewish experience, not an experience shared by all of humanity. Shavuos, the giving of the Torah. Again, a personal Jewish experience. And Sukkot, our wandering in the desert, the huts, the tents that we had there in the desert, and therefore we move out into the tents. These are all stories about Zeichel Yetziat Mitzrayim, as the prayer book refers to them, in remembering the story of the Exodus of Egypt. That's the national particularistic element of these festivals. But they are also reflecting the agricultural year. They are also part of the global functioning of nature. Pesach is also the spring festival. Shavuos is the reaping festival. And Sukkot is the harvest festival when all the harvest is brought home. So they are also universalistic festivals. Now what's interesting is that the two elements line up. So Pesach is the spring festival, and it's also the spring of Jewish creation. It's when we began coming into existence. So our national spring and the global spring, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, line up in parallel. That's Pesach. It's the spring festival on a global level. That's a shared human experience. And it's also a uniquely Jewish experience of the beginning of the spring, of the coming into existence of the Jewish nation. Shavuos, which is the giving of the Torah, is us reaching the peak of our potential. The Torah has been given. We now have the whole blueprint, everything laid out of that which we wish to achieve. That's like the ingathering of the crops. And then we have the harvest, when the culmination, the actualization, which is Sukkot, and so on. So there's a perfect lineup between the national experience and the international experience. But again, the festivals themselves reflect this dichotomy also. What I'm trying to say in brief is this dual element runs through Judaism very, very, it's a thread the whole time. It's there, present in so much of what we do. These two elements of the story. Shabbat, and this will be the last example I give, but really the examples are countless. We can look at almost every mitzvah and see these two elements of it. We stand on Shabbat and we make Kiddush, and we declare what Shabbat is about. What do we say? It's Zeichel Yetziat Mitzrayim. It's in memory of our unique national event, the Exodus of Egypt. And it's also Zeichel Maaseh Bereshit. It's also in memory of the creation of the world, the sort of global shared human experience. So everything that we do has these dual elements. Everything's an exaggeration. Much of what we do has these dual elements: the uniquely Jewish experience and the shared human experience. So again, I ask, what are we meant to make of this? How are we meant to understand this? And the key to the question is actually lies in mistakes, in inverted commas, that it appears that God made. It lies in a terrible 2,000 year history of humanity in which things seem to go wrong. And I'm referring here to the 2,000 odd years, which is the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis, the first book of the Torah. Because if we read the story of the Torah, one way of reading the first stories of the Torah is a message of valuing that which is universal, and yet skepticism about grand sweeping all human projects, unless they start from the particular, from the narrow, from the parochial, from the tribe, from the home, from the family. And if we look at the content of Bereshit, very briefly summarizing the first book of the Torah, it goes as follows. Humanity comes into existence, Adam and Eve. I'm not going to talk here about evolution and how we understand the first humans, but there are humans who are in some sense the founders and parents of all humanity. The first humans have a moral and spiritual sense. We'll call them Adam and Chava. We're then described, told about two sweeping visions of what humanity can be on an international social order. The first is the generation of the flood. And what the Torah describes to us is free market gone haywire, a complete breakdown into anarchy, in which might is right, those who prosper and are talented achieve wealth, and those who are weak and incapable are left behind, and it's just chaos. And the result of that is the flood. The flood is, of course, the symbolic consequence. The flood is chaos. The flood is this sweeping force of water which knows no boundaries and sweeps all aside in front of it. It breaks down everything, it erases everything, it washes over everything and leaves nothing standing in its wake. And this is the appropriate response to a society which has become a flood and hasn't recognized it. A society which has tremendous energy and tremendous power and tremendous force, but knows no barriers, just chaos. So this is the first sort of global vision of what happens. Interestingly, the language used there is almost heretical. It describes God as looking at the world, and Vayinochem, he regrets what human beings are becoming over here. So he almost looks at the creatures he's brought into existence, and he says, this is just terrible. This is atrocious. Then the next society is described. This is the society described as the generation of dispersion. This is a society described by the Torah as embarking on great state-led building projects. Now we know something about the building projects that are being described, because we know in the ancient Near East, there are societies which are very controlled, very state-led, in which the kings are gods and the gods are kings. And they build these enormous monuments, the ziggurats they call them, these enormous towers. You can see that's all over areas around which our ancestors lived, in Ur Custom, in that region over there of Ur. And the Torah describes this state project, in that the Medrash brings such powerful language to describe how humans began being seen. And the Medrash says that in these building projects, if a brick fell to the ground and broke, people would cry, "Oh, we've lost our brick." If a human fell to the ground, they would say, human's expendable, we can always get another one. Meaning to say, this is a society which is so hierarchical, so disciplined, so controlled, so structured, that they cease to see a human as an individual. A human is just a brick in building the apparatus of state and national and international achievement. Now we understand why this story follows the story of the flood. Because they learned the lesson of the flood, but they overlearned the lesson. They saw the chaos of this anarchic free market, over free market, which is the story of the flood. And they saw the breakdown in society, that this is swept away by flood. And so we're going to now go to the opposite. Everything's going to be very structured, very ordered, very controlled. It describes the Torah, so evocatively describes that generation. It says this is a generation where they all spoke one tongue. They all used one language. There's no way of thinking outside the box. It's literally groupthink and group speech, like 1984. The whole world, the Torah says it like this. It says the whole world speaks safar achad v'lashon achad. They're all speaking one language, one way of talking. It's complete control, complete structure, all thinking the same way. And this is a disaster. There's no room for human creativity. There's no room for an Avraham Avinu to emerge. Avraham is the countercultural iconoclast of all time. Iconoclast is an old-fashioned word. Nowadays, it's taken to mean iconoclast is someone who is who's different, who's able to question the values of the time. The classic meaning is literally an idol smasher, an icon smasher. That's what Avram is, right? This is what Avram does. He's a child and he smashes idols. He looks at everything that society believes and questions it and says this doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So Avram is the ultimate societal critic, the ultimate critic of society, the ultimate who questions the assumptions of society. And there's no room for him in this control world, this over-state model. And therefore, again, it gets destroyed. God doesn't destroy, doesn't punish the people. He teaches them different tongues, and they lose the ability to communicate to each other, and it all falls apart. Suddenly, there's multiple voices. There's, in the language of the Medrash, 70 languages. And they can't speak to each other anymore. They can't communicate, and that's frustrating. That's terrible. But there's no longer room for just one way of thinking. There's now different cultures. Every language is a different way of thinking, a different way of viewing the world. But what's going on in Bereshit is a criticism of society. It's a critique. It's a skepticism about societies being able to find equilibrium easily, about societies not being able to form a healthy balance, about societies being able to avoid one extreme or another. The extreme of the flood with this chaotic, anarchic, overly free market model, or the criticism of the Darvloga with this state apparatus in which humans cease to have room for creativity, in which they lose their individuality and their ability to be themselves, and they want us to think the same way. So what's the solution to the problem? Well, Bereshit seems to tell us in the continuation the solution to the problem. And the solution to the problem is to stop thinking about grand, sweeping visions, to begin thinking about the family, the individual, the person, friendships, and suddenly the whole of Bereshit switches track. And it's no longer talking about global pictures, no longer talking about the whole of society. It now begins telling us a story about family. And what goes on in this family? Husbands get married to wives, they argue, and they love each other. And siblings fight. And they fall out with each other, and there's jealousy, and there's competition for parental approval, and there's parents arguing about how to bring up their children, and there's sibling rivalry, and they're falling out with each other. And just read the stories of the patriarchs, it's amazing. What are we told about them? We're told about Avram and Sarah inviting guests into their home. We're told about them having an argument. We're told about them loving each other. We're told about them grappling how to raise the kids. We're told about the kids fighting with each other. And suddenly the whole of Bereshit becomes a story about a family. And what it seems to be telling us is that the way to rebuild the society, which the first part of Bereshit has told us is skeptical, doesn't seem to be working, is by building up, by little piece, by building up through personal relationships and personal connections. And the Torah is skeptical about the idea of someone who talks about grand sweeping love. I love humanity. I love everyone. Just everyone is great. If you love everyone equally, it seems to be telling us you don't love anyone. You don't really know what love is. It's about the personal connection, the individual care. If you can't get on with your brother or your sister, your mother or your father, your son or your daughter, your uncles or your aunts, then you can't get on with anyone. Unless one can get on with the person who's at home, or the person who's local, but the person you're intimately mixing with and having a relationship with. And God, in turn, begins relating to people differently. He now begins to relating to people personally and directly and individually. And he says, I'm going to embrace your story. You're a family person. You come from a particular tribe, a particular nation. I'm going to be part of that. I'm going to form a connection with this tribe. I'm going to now be part of your personal story. I'm not just going to be the God of the sweeping visions. I'm now going to be the God who's involved in your day-to-day life and your intimate experiences, your family experiences. I'm going to be involved in how you love and how you hate. I'm going to be involved in how you are born and how you die. I'm going to be involved in how you earn your living, in how you live and how you flourish, and where you live and how you farm, and what you do in business. Because this is the sort of God that I'm now going to be. I'm going to be part of your life, because that's where spirituality has to start. And it's at this point that Judaism makes the shift from the universal to the particularistic, not because it ceases to care about the universal, but because it believes that the universal can only be achieved by starting with the particular, by starting with that which is local. It's a very interesting thing. I was reading the biography of Lenin. Now, Lenin was not a cynical figure like Stalin. Stalin, from what we can tell, was a cynical figure who used and abused the ideals of communism just to make himself a dictator and to seize power and so on and so forth. Lenin genuinely sacrificed himself for the ideals of communism. Now, the ideals of communism are very beautiful ideals. He cared about the working class. He cared about human misery. And at the stage when he started his fight, he was battling the might of the Tsarist Empire. He had no real conviction of success. In fact, he had to run away in exile to Switzerland and live for many years away from his own home country because he believed in the working class and cared for them. What's fascinating is that he seemed to have been sincere in caring for the working class as a group, as a concept, and yet on a personal level was not a particularly nice individual at all. On a personal level, interacting with the people around him, not much love, not much care, not much kindness. But the abstract ideal of a class of people who he cared for, absolutely, and seemingly sincerely so. And it's this which the Torah is skeptical about. The idea of loving in the abstract, trying to build society in the abstract, just goes wrong. It's dangerous. And it ends up with Lenin. It ends up with an ability to cause incredible, immeasurable misery to countless individuals in the name of an abstract care for a class of individuals. And this is what the Torah seems to be warning us over here. And suddenly the Torah shifts into trying to build up from a family into a tribe, from a tribe into a nation. This is a transition that takes place in the next book of the Torah, Exodus. And ultimately from a nation into, back into universalistic care and concern, but only once we're able to correct ourselves. So this is a reading of the journey that the Torah takes us on, and perhaps an understanding and an insight into the story of Bereshit and Shemot, and that transition that takes place. So getting back to our the original question and the topic that I was asked to address, it seems to me that Judaism has a very strong universalistic element. It has not turned its back on the universal, but it is skeptical about the ability to build the universal unless it starts off with a love that's close to home. It needs us to be able to love, and it needs us to be able to be countercultural. I may have said this before to this group, if so, I apologize. But we called ourselves, the original name that us Jews had was not Jew. Jew is derived from Judah, from the tribe that dominated after the destruction of the temple, the Jewish population. Tribe of Judah, Yehudah in Hebrew, when it moved to European languages, the Y changed to a J, like Jerusalem and Yerushalayim, etc. That's not our original title. Our original title as Jews was Ivri. Now, what's the meaning of the word Ivri? So Ivri means a Hebrew. It gave its name to the Hebrew, the language of the modern-day state of Israel, Ivrit. Ivri means a Hebrew. The first person given this title of Hebrew was Avram HaIvri, Abraham the Hebrew. Now, what is the meaning of this word Hebrew? So it's possible it has an ethnic sense to it. One of the ancestors that the Torah tells us about that Avram had was someone called Aver. So it's possible Ivri means a descendant of Aver, from the tribe of Aver descendants. But the sages give it a different meaning. And they give it a metaphorical meaning. Aver means in Hebrew also a bank. A bank as in a bank of a river. And they say that Avram HaIvri means the one who came from the other bank of the river, the other side of the river. Now this could mean geographically so. After all, we know where Avram came from. His family came from Iraq, which is the other side of the great river in the Middle East. The great river in the Middle East is not the Nile, but the Euphrates, the river that winds its way up, all the way up through Iraq and on through Syria and over into the southern end of Turkey. That's the great river, the Euphrates. Avram came from the other side, Me'eva Hana, we say in the Haggadah. He came from the other side of the river means the Euphrates, traveled to Israel. So he's the one who comes from the other side of the river. But the sages then give it almost a midrashic interpretation. And they say what's unique about Avram is that he's able to stand on the other side of the river to everyone else. He's able to be countercultural. He's able to question that which is assumed by everyone else. By the way, the ability to question assumptions is what makes a great scientist and a great thinker. Most of us don't notice the assumptions we're making. So moderate thinkers, and I hope we're all moderately good thinkers, are able to reason and think carefully within the sort of the norm, the box of how our society thinks. A great thinker can make this leap outside the box and look at it from an overview and question the very assumptions they found. These are thinkers that make what they call a paradigm shift, a secular shift, a sea change in the whole way of thinking. Great sea changes that have occurred, for example, in the history of human thought, have been the move from seeing the forces of nature as being expressing the personal whims of the gods or even God. So there's the thunder god is fighting the sun gods, he's fighting the cloud gods, he's fighting the moon gods, and that's what causes earthquakes in nature. So understanding a sort of scientific worldview in which there's a common theme of scientific rules at work. That's a great thinker. Then a Newton is another great thinker, right? The ability to align such disparate physical events as the tides and the moon and gravity and apples falling off trees, and all of them, bringing them together in a couple of universal laws. These are great things that make sort of sea change shifts in how we think. You're able to question the very assumption of what it means to be human in the world within which we live. So this is the quality of Ivri, someone who has the self-confidence, the ability, the vision to stand on the other side of the river and question everything. The ultimate iconoclast, the ultimate ability to question the assumption of everything. That's the title Avram had. Now this seems like a midrashic interpretation of the title Ivri. When you say I'm an Ivri, I'm a Hebrew, I mean I'm able to be different to what society assumes. We now know through archaeology and other sources that this is actually the literal meaning of the word Ivri. The Egyptians, for example, called the wandering strangers that entered into their land Aviru, same Semitic origins of the word as Ivri. Aviru means an alien, the other. The eternal other, the eternal alien. And therefore, when I say I'm a Hebrew, or I'm a Jew, I mean I am an eternal other. I'm, through the gift of the Torah, always challenged to think differently to the society with which we are part. Always to question, to criticize, to challenge the assumptions of society. And by the way, this exists to this day. I mean, one of the greatest privileges of being a young Jew is that we are forced to confront and think about life and meaning and purpose and identity from a much younger age. You know, we're forced to think, by the way, I'm not even talking religiously, secular religious in this sense, not the point. We're forced from a young age to think, what am I? What's my identity? Can I resolve being British and Jewish? Where's my loyalty? How do I identify myself? And it immediately forces us to feel a little different to our society that we're part of, and to be able to always be a little bit of an alien, a little bit of another. By the way, Judaism, please God, is not and will never be 100% politically correct. It will never be 100% in line with the values of the day. Because if it happened to match 21st century Britain, then that's static, that's frozen. A society that can't accept the ability of people to question the assumptions of society It's a society that will be frozen and static forever, because no change can occur unless there's a few outliers who are willing to question those changes. Now, many of those outliers will be cranks. Many of them will be freaks. Many of them won't deserve to be given the time of day to listen. Of course, most people that challenge scientific orthodoxy are completely wrong. Most people that challenge moral orthodoxy are completely wrong. But we have to have a society which has a voice and ability to allow questioning, to allow criticism, to allow things to be said that are different to what's assumed. And Jews are always going to be at the forefront of that voice. By the way, this is probably the secret to anti-Semitism. This is probably part of what it's connected with. A society which can't tolerate the stranger. It can't tolerate the alien. It's a society that's doomed. And the canary in the coal mine, the litmus test, the first warning signal of a society that can't cope with that which is different, and a society which can't cope with the Jews, because we're always a bit weird, we're always a bit strange, we're always a bit bizarre, we're always a little bit different to the rest of society. There's a very, very beautiful thought from the Rambam, from Maimonides. There's a verse in the Torah in which God says, those who curse you, he's speaking to Abraham, will be cursed, and those who bless you will be blessed. And we take that as a sort of spiritual thing, you know, those who curse you, God says, I will curse them, and those that bless you, I will bless them. The Rambam doesn't take it like that. Maimonides says, those that curse you will be cursed, meaning a society which can't tolerate an Abraham. It can't tolerate an Ivri, a Hebrew, someone who's different, who's questioning, who's smashing idols, is a doomed culture. It's a culture that can't tolerate difference. If you can't tolerate difference, it's finished. And a society which blesses you, which can tolerate an Abraham, can tolerate that eternal mosquito buzzing around and irritating it and questioning, a society which can tolerate Hebrews amongst it, Ivrim amongst it, those who are the other side of the river, who are questioning the assumptions, such a society is blessed. Such a society can flourish and can achieve change and can become something different. So this is the role of the Jew, to be the eternal Ivri, to be the eternal challenger, the eternal critic, the one who's able to think out of the box. So we haven't given up on our universalist mission. We are just skeptical about being able to deal with it unless we start at home. Charity starts at home. Unless we're able to start with our family, with our immediate neighbors, with those who we are closest to. Unless we are able to relate to God as a neighbor. Unless we're able to relate to God as a being with whom we have a personal relationship. Unless our charity can be personalized. Unless we can put our hearts and souls into genuine connections. We don't see true spirituality as someone who's able to live apart. We don't see true spirituality found in someone who cuts themselves off from society. We don't have a monastic order in Judaism. We don't have a lifestyle in which the peak of holiness is a religious leader who separates themselves from normal relationships, who engages in celibacy, who engages in removal from society. We see spirituality found in day-to-day interaction. We see spirituality found in the consideration of, putting one's breakfast bowl in the dishwasher and not leaving it in the sink. Consideration found in, washing out the sink from the toothpaste left in it. We see spirituality in that day-to-day lived experience, living experience. And this is the particularistic in Judaism. But the ultimate aim, of course, is universal. God created all human beings to be his children. God created all human beings from one Adam because we're all ultimately brothers and sisters. And therefore the heart of the mission is no doubt universal, but the method of the mission is concretized, is particular, is particularistic. And this is really the secret to the halachic system, which immediately takes abstract concepts and tries to make it actual. Immediately takes these values of love and charity and says, you know what? Rubbish, nonsense. Talk about love and charity all day. Unless you concretize it in halacha, in practice, in who you should give the charity and how you should give the charity and when you should give it, it will never happen. Unless there's percentages put in place, 10%, you'll end up never even giving 1%. And this is the system of halacha, which immediately takes abstract values and it wants to make it actual. It wants to make it concrete. It wants to make it particular. It wants to make it legal. It wants to make it part of daily lived and breathed and experienced life. And we pay a terrible price for that. Let's make no mistake. We are caught in a structure of ritual, which is a very hard burden to bear. And a lot of the time when we're saying brachas, we're not thinking about the meaning of what we're saying. But then it's in our hands. A bracha provides a structure, a framework for religiosity. Halacha provides a structure for religiosity. But now we need to fill it with content. Halacha can only ever be a framework. It can only ever be a structure. The inner meaning has to come from us, because all inner meaning can only come from oneself. It can never be imposed from the outside. But how do we deal with the system which says, if we leave everything coming from within oneself, it won't happen? And therefore it does impose an outside structure, but then we need to fill it with meaning. This is what the halachic system is. This is the eternal challenge of the halachic system, but this is the privilege of it also. Because if we live a system in which we are always making brachot, then maybe once a month we'll think about the words we're mumbling before we eat food, and we'll give it inner content. If we're always giving charity, then maybe once a month we'll actually live and empathize and experience what we're doing. And this is the balance that the halachic system tries to find. I've spoken for about 45 minutes there, so I'll pause because this was meant to be maybe I shouldn't have spoken so long. This was meant to be a little interactive also. I hope that gives sort of the beginning of an answer of the question I was asked, but maybe I'll hand over to the floor if there's any comments anyone wants to make.
Hi, Rav. Can I ask?
Hi, Eddie.
Hi. Sorry, I'll put my camera on.
How about
Hi.
you?
How would you describe a personal relationship with God as opposed to like an impersonal one?
It's realization that God. It's a lot. I mean, it's a lot, and it's a. Can I put the question on hold, because I'm very happy to talk about it. I don't want us to. I want to drift too far off topic either. So let me come back to you and address it. Unless if people want to just ask about the core topic, and then we'll come back to that. Josh.
Hi, Rabbi.
Hi.
I know this is a bit of a cynical question, but I never really thought of it before until you gave this share. I understand how you can read the first few chapters of Bereshit as kind of like skeptical of universalism. But why can't I also then read the rest of Tanakh as skepticism of particular? I understand there are a few individuals that very, very clearly make it work, like Abraham and Moshe, but like ultimately Abraham tries to pass on these moral precepts to his ancestors, who end up going down to Mitzrayim and losing them and becoming slaves, and he loses all the souls he made in Haran. And Yitzchak and Yishmael end up, well, maybe not Yitzchak and Yishmael, but Yaakov and Esav as brothers do end up fighting with each other and don't make up. And like Sefer Yeshua does okay, but it doesn't exactly preach the balance between universalism and particularism, because there's a lot of killing going on. And then Shoftim is a bit of a failure on the part of Jewish people, and like all their time in the desert, they don't do so well, even after Matan Torah. And the two stories you brought about where we, like the two stories that are supposed to be examples of how the particular are supposed to teach the universal kind of thing, like Shlomo HaMelech having that amazing period with the Beis HaMikdash ends up leading to assimilation and sin. And then the story of Yonah, the prophet is skeptical in the first place, yeah, etc., kind of thing.
Okay. So you've just presented an elaborate summary of human failure, and the Torah and the rest of Nach is nothing if not a in-your-face, painful, with inability to ignore message of the possibility of humans messing up. No doubt about that. The question isn't, can humans fail? The question is, what can be salvaged from failure to allow us to carry on and learn from our mistakes? And the argument being put forward is that personal connection, starting off small and building up from that, has a self-correcting element to it that the large-scale model doesn't have. And that's all the argument is. The dysfunctionality of the family of the others in the Sefer Bereshit is shocking, beyond words. No doubt about that. It's incredible what happens in that family. And it goes on and on and on. The whole story of the 40 years in the desert is a story of one failure after another. The difference is that you can pick yourself up from that. Because at the end of the day, when push comes to shove and when it reaches the breaking point, family pulls back. And they support each other and they emerge from it. And this is the point that's being made over here. But that's exactly the message of the Torah. If it was simple, if there was no failure, then that would be the end of the conversation, right? It'd be easy. The Torah is not presenting this idealistic picture of, family comes along and now the music begins playing. Otherwise, Bereshit would have finished and that would have been the end of the story. The story is horrible after that. It's terrible after that. The point is, however, that this is the only point of optimism from which something can be built. And that's the message of the rest of Nach. Nothing more than that. Hi, yes.
You just made it like quite clear that we are a nation that should help others and we shouldn't be an insular nation. So why, especially like in the older generations, there's such a pushback against, you know, like helping the developing world? Why is it so much focus on charity starts at home, which is obviously important, but why isn't there like give 7% of charity to Jews and 3% to non-Jews, or 7% to your community at home and 3% further away from home?
Okay. So thank you for asking that, because that really brings it back to what we should talk about. And Eddie, your question is a massively important question, but it's a topic of its own class. You know, how are we meant to relate to God? Because this is the core question. So I am a proud flag-bearing representative of the older generation in this. Absolutely. I think that 7-3% is a great formula, and that's what I want. That's what I want to explain. The two extremes are both dangerous. There is a possibility of taking the particularistic model so far that we lose care, empathy, and action and money giving to those who are suffering. And I absolutely, firmly and clearly want to say we should be using Jewish money for these things. We should be giving time for global poverty and for global needs and other things, and it is absolutely a crucial and core Jewish value, categorically so. But equally, we need to start at home, because when we don't start at home and when we neglect those who are nearest to us, who are our family, our brothers and sisters, we drift too far into the universal project, and we lose that sensitivity that I'm talking about over here. And I want to navigate that tightrope between those two halves. When I said that, when I started this by saying, are we particularistic or universalistic? And the answer was both. That is what I mean. And if you think that 3% isn't enough out of the 10%, then good luck to you. So give 15% of your money, 15% of your money to charity, and that way you can equalize it. But the core halacha is a framework. And the framework, the structure of the framework is, I will never, ever, ever let you forget what kindness means with the people who are next door to you, with your neighbors and with your family. Because if you forget that and you go off on projects of big national projects and caring for people who are far away, you risk becoming a Lenin. You risk becoming someone who talks about charity in the abstract and in the ideal, and forgets that it's the day-to-day toil of actually getting on with someone who's near you that molds you into the person that you need to be. And the only way we can be confident that you will be the person who continues giving the 3% to India is by being the person who gives the 7% to Jewish causes. And this is the point. And I'll tell you something, tragically, I don't want to overgeneralize here, there are exceptions, but you know and I know, and we all know that most of the world's population are not giving 3% of their money to India. And if we carry on giving 7% of our money to our shuls, to our yeshivas, to our sems, to the people close by, to the genuinely poverty-stricken Jews that are around, then we will continue to give the 3% to India, and maybe more than that. Good luck, give the same 7% to India also. But then it's the 7% beyond your 10% that you're giving to Marseille. Because it's only by giving that which is up close, which will keep the ability of us as Jews to be countercultural, to have that commitment to a legal system, which means that we're tithing our money and giving 10%. Who else is tithing their money and giving 10% en masse? I'm not talking about rare individuals. I think as a society, that we're a society that's taken so seriously the halacha that is only preserved by us starting at home. And I'll tell you something, the only way we can preserve the Jewish giving of the 3% is by us giving the 7%. And that's what I mean when I say I'm a flag-bearing, card-carrying, I think that's absolutely the right formula, because it's the only hope that we'll carry on giving 7%.
So
Yes.
Can I ask a quick question relating to that? Why would it be that it would be best to give money to a man learning in Kollel over a child starving in India? I feel like there are levels of which someone needs more than the other, and we can understand that on a humanitarian level, if not from a religious level.
Yes. Because, first of all, obviously, if you have two people in front of you and one is starving and one isn't, you give to the one who's starving, no doubt. That's not under question. If there's someone there in front of you, you have to give to them. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Someone's starving. However, we need people learning Torah. We need Rabbonim, we need Talmidei Chachamim, we need teachers of Torah, because that's the only way to keep the Jewish people going. And we have a lesson that's too important to be, we have a message to give the world that's too important to be lost. We need the framework of halacha, because that is the only thing that will keep us giving. And you know what? If we stop giving the 7% to Jewish causes, again, we will end up not giving the 3% to India either. We will not end up giving to the people that are needy for that also. And Judaism needs to survive. There's a message that we're giving that is too valuable. The unique spirituality of Judaism, this earthy spirituality, the spirituality that believes that the best a human can be is one who's living in the world and elevating its spirituality, is a message that we have not yet managed to convey to the world. We've shared a lot with the world, monotheism and spirituality and charity and love. We have not yet shared that we have not yet finished our mission of things that we need to deliver. And that's necessary. We need learned people. We need yeshivas. I'm absolutely empathetic with you and in agreement with you that we can be too parochial. And the truth is, if I was speaking to the older generation, I will say I'm a proud, flag-bearing, card-carrying member of the younger generation in this respect, because you are correct, it can go too far. And probably for obvious historical reasons and Jewish history and other things, we can forget the universal element of the Holocaust and other things. We can forget the universal elements of our tradition, there's no doubt. But equally, speaking to you and the younger generation, I'm saying to you, don't forget the particular either. It's absolutely vital. Both halves need to be said. We need to balance both in our practice.
If there's no one else asking a question, I don't want to ask if anyone else wants to ask. So, does anyone else? Okay, it's a three-pronged question, all of which I hope are relatively straightforward to ask. First question is, what was the plan? Do we know what the plan was, so to speak, God's plan, before Avraham came along? In other words, was there a Torah that he had in mind to give to humanity? Did he want to give it to all of humanity? Question one. Question two is, why did he have to limit giving this Torah and investing in a relationship with one person and one family? In other words, if another Avraham had come along as well, which is conceivable, could God equally have created a covenant with that person and that nation as well? And part three is, I found it absolutely fascinating and quite moving how you were contrasting two extreme sort of economic systems, which have been in massive debate for the last 100 years, comparing like a sort of laissez-faire extreme version with the flood and then the statist version of above. I've never heard that before. And just wondering, you say so the solution is to actually just zoom into a very particularist family dynamic. Eventually we do become a nation. I've often asked, does the Torah have much to say about the kind of economic system? I usually hear people say, well, the Torah is actually not, it's much more interested in how people act as individuals on a society level. Do you think the Torah has much to say on that, or is it actually not so bothered by that, the kind of question of what political/economic system it wants?
So I'll take your first two questions together, and then I'll deal with the third one. The pre-Avram, it would appear that God wanted a relationship with the whole of humanity, and retreated from that model to a relationship with a particular family as a result of the events that I described. And the retreat was a retreat which wasn't a giving up of the initial aim, but a recognition that it needed to go via an individual people, and an individual family, in order to reach the ultimate goal. Now, what does it mean for God to retreat and make a mistake? And this is the language that's used. Vayinochem Hashem. Hashem changes direction. Presumably, it means for us as human beings to understand and have a learning curve here, to see what was a failed attempt, and therefore understand what the particularist mission of Judaism is about. Does this relationship have to only be with one person? Presumably, yes. Presumably, once an Avram steps forward and his family becomes the family they're going to leave, then the way for the rest of humanity to engage with it is for that sense of family to spread, for the tent of Avram to become ever more inclusive and ever more big tent, ever more including people within it and within the family itself. Avram is renamed when he achieves his mission. He moves from Avram to Avraham, and the translation of his new name as given in the Torah is he becomes Av Hamon Goyim. He becomes the father of many peoples. So it's a fascinating thing that with him becoming the poster boy of the particularist model, the title he's given is the universalistic model, Av Hamon Goyim, the father of many nations. So the role he adopts as being the family man par excellence in this new mode of spirituality is as a route to become to get back to the overall universal model. In terms of your third question, which is I think the fascinating one, I want to now have my cake and eat it, and I want to argue that the Torah does not present much about broad sweeping economic and political systems, and that's because it trusts humans to come up with the right balance if you never forget family and if you build up from family. Because of course we are meant to be a nation, and ultimately we're not just meant to be a nation, we're meant to be pan-national. We want the whole of humanity to become our brothers and sisters in this endeavor of spirituality, but we can only get there if we never forget the family in it. So we became a nation when we are a nation of families, and we will, please God, one day become pan-national, and all humanity will share in this mission when all of us can join in this picture, starting with love that's close to home, when all of us can start with family. What then will be the right system? Well, actually, it probably depends on the circumstance. It could be in the ancient world, it was about a king, monarchy, because democracy wasn't an option. It could be later, it'll be democracy. It could be sometimes more statist interventionist is right, in which, you can see a Tory government ending up with 120% national debt and throwing money around because a country goes through a particular crisis of COVID or whatever it is. I think the Torah is happy to leave it to humanity to work out the practicalities of what the best system is, and presumably that will vary based on different cultures and different nations and different societies and different things going on, as long as it doesn't lose sight of its building bricks, and the building bricks are the individual and family. And I think that's why the Torah doesn't present this very developed model of a political system.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, sure.
First of all, thank you, as usual, for a wonderful talk. You mentioned Lenin and how, in favor of the abstract, like he pursued the abstract ideal, but in person he wasn't a very good person. But there are plenty of examples of other leaders that we today in the West at least look at more positively, who probably very much kind of either sacrificed or didn't care about a lot of personal values, but favored abstract ones and ended up being extremely successful, like Martin Luther King, or maybe lots of Rebbeim. So do you think that there's ever a role for sacrificing the personal in favor of the abstract?
Yeah. Okay. So this is a very good question. I do think there are cases where you have to sacrifice the personal in favor of the abstract, but then you have to realize it's a sacrifice, and it depends whether it's a necessary sacrifice or it's a question of orientation and direction, and how one views the world. If someone has forgotten the value of the personal and those who are near and dear, and is focused on abstract sort of idealism, I think Judaism would be very skeptical about this being true spirituality. And if it turns out that there are, Rabbonim who have fallen into this trap, then so be it. Then they're also, then there are many Lenins. I mean, yes, that's what I'm saying. I don't think that a true spiritual leader should forget the power of the personal. Now, and by the way, if you look at the literature, the sort of stories told about Gedolim, it's always about that message. It's always about the personal. Now, the historicity of every story told about a great Jewish leader, who knows? But there's a lot to be learned from the stories that are told, even if they're not historical. What is seen as a virtue? And you will almost never find a story in the literature which is about a great person sacrificing their family and everyone else. All the stories are about the person and individual. So it'll be the story about Reb Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the founding father of Chabad Chassidut, who doesn't turn up in shul on Kol Nidre, and the whole shul and the whole community are waiting. Where's the rabbi? It's the the most spiritual night of the year. It's the beginning of the Yom Kippur services, and he hasn't turned up. And eventually they send out a search party to look for him, and they find him in a house at the end of the village, rocking a baby to sleep because he was walking to shul and he had the baby crying, and he went into the house and the parents had left the baby to go to shul in Yom Kippur, and the baby's asleep, and he looks after the baby and rocks it to sleep. And these stories are a dime a dozen. I mean, every Godel story has that as its theme. The story of the Rabbi Zobin, the founder of the Muslim movement, who turns up in a new town on a Shabbat, on a Friday, and the most important members of the town compete to have him as their guest. They can't wait for him to eat with them Friday night, and you imagine this luxurious meal in which he's going to sing Zemirot and tell Divrei Torah, And Rabbi Zobin turns up and he runs this very quick meal of 45 minutes and tries to keep it as fast moving as possible. And they ask him why, and he says because he wants the staff to be able to get an early night and not have to stay up too late serving the meal and washing up afterwards and everything. So these stories of the personal are really the bread and butter of the whole literature of sort of the Godel genre. If there were rabbis who messed up on this, they messed up on this, then it was wrong. Now, is it ever
maybe
possible?
that's in the spiritual realm, but it seems like maybe at least, I don't know if you should look at political leaders who pursues like huge kind of social moral progress in society as achieving a spiritual goals also. But it seems like there's an element, I don't know if this is also true in the rabbinic world, but some of the people that make the big differences in some ways had to become like extremists in a certain way, because they had to, what was necessary to drive through their goal was such a crazy commitment at the expense of so much that no kind of normal and balanced holistic person could have achieved that. And therefore someone taking some of the messages that you've been sharing in this year might not achieve those things because because dedication to the first kind of concentric circle of family might necessarily have prevented kind of what was necessary for them to achieve the larger kind of goal. So it seems like there is some sort of element here where there's no one right way. In every world there will be some people that will kind of disregard the message to stay dedicated first to your closest concentric circle. But maybe as a society, if most people favor their concentric circle and then you get these anomalies, then overall it works.
It's very hard to answer on a historical basis. What were the marriages like of great figures and what was their relationship to their kids and so on. So I can't give you a guarantee about every great figure in Jewish history to know this. What I can say is what the literature presents as an ideal and the stories that we tell. And the stories that we tell are always about the personal acts of kindness and the personal consideration of great figures. And these are always the way an ideal is held up. Now, what happens in real life, who knows? I don't know. But the principle, at least, is very, very well established. In fact, there was one figure in Jewish history who was an exception to this, and that's Moshe, who did separate from normal life. And there's a whole story in the Torah about Aaron and Miriam criticizing him for that, until God himself says Moshe is an exception. He's the one figure in Jewish history who's given the exception card in which he's told he doesn't have to live a normal family life. Everyone else in history who's a great Jewish figure is expected to live a life of engagement with the world, and when they don't, they're criticized for so doing. So the Gemara talks about figures, colleagues of Rabbi Kiva, who didn't engage in regular, normal, communal or family life, and they're criticized for so doing. Now, there are exceptional times when you can't live a normal life, but in principle, I'm not aware of any great figure who's held up as an ideal because they adopt the life of an ascetic, because they adopt a life of removal from regular communal and family life and personal acts of kindness. So can we go through historically? Do I know what Rabbi Kiva's marriage was like? Don't know many sources about that. But the stories told are always stories that emphasize their personal connection to individuals, their personal relationships and their personal acts of kindness. Now, what could be an exception to this? There could be times of war and times of conflict and emergency when there's no choice. If you are engaged in literally pekuach nefesh, saving lives, you're rescuing kids in the Holocaust, whatever, then maybe you will sacrifice your own family for that because you have no choice. But that's not an ideal. It's an emergency situation which you have to act in a certain way. I don't have anything in the sources that holds us up as an ideal. The closest we have to a thinker who idealized asceticism is, of course, the Rambam. And on a practical level, the Rambam absolutely did not approve of it. He saw it as an abstract ideal, but he said this was not true to human nature. So whilst the Kabbalists saw spiritual content in engaging the world, the Rambam saw it as spiritual diminution, but it was a reluctant accommodation of it, but he didn't hold up asceticism as a practical way of life. So there's no living tradition of which I'm aware that approves of asceticism as an ideal. The only tradition that ever was the Maimonidean tradition, and the Rambam did not see it as a practical ideal at all. So the best answer I can give to you is what the information we have. The information we have is that the great figures that we hold up as role models did not live that life that you're describing.
Rabbi, can I ask you something? If you're done, sorry, I don't know if you.
Sure, yeah, it was better.
So first of all, I just want to like echo Edward's question earlier. It really that like struck quite a chord for me, just regarding like you know, a relationship with Hashem. How do we know that we like doing it right, so to speak? You know, like I recently read a book called World Mask by Rabbi Tat, and I was like, oh my God, I've been misinformed for 27, 28 years, and like, yeah, it really got me questioning, like when I think about Hashem and contemplate like my relationship with Hashem, it actually made me think like, I don't even know if I'm serving idols right now or not, given how little I know about like what I'm trying to achieve here. So, I mean, obviously you can't address this tonight. I understand it's late. You've been through the shir tonight, but maybe just like, maybe we can create a topic out of that for weeks to come. That would be really cool. If everyone's on board with that kind of a subject. And then also, if I'm understanding everything correctly, which like, I'm not sure that I am, but I don't see how why do we have to choose whether it's between like our personal relationships and the way that we take personal responsibility and conduct ourselves within our family life and our personal life? Why is that a choice between how we do that, like on a more micro level and a more macro level? Like, I feel like congruently, if you're living true to yourself, okay, and you're living a life of like, let's say, morals and ethics, then you're probably going to be treating your family quite well, and you're probably going to be treating society at large quite well. Obviously, we're human beings. Obviously, we get it wrong. Obviously, we make mistakes. But I feel like it's like a one or the other based on what we've been talking about. And like, I don't see why that should be, if that makes any sense at all.
Sure. Okay, so the first question I'll put on hold, and I'm very happy for either Ollie or I see Marco has now rejoined us. So Marco, to note that now as a topic for future weeks. In terms of your second question, thank you for giving me this chance to clarify this. Again, I want to reiterate, I'm definitely not advocating an either-or model. The ideal is absolutely and definitely both. The question simply comes down to as follows. In a world of finite resources, where we are willing to give a certain percentage, as it were, to our spiritual and religious endeavors, what is the foundation that shouldn't be sacrificed? What's the first layer and what's the second layer? And the halachic answer to the question is, first comes the particularistic, then the universalistic, not the other way around. If we wish to give more, then we're already in the world beyond strict halacha, then absolutely give more to the universal also. And this was my response to Talia, in which I said, if you want to give more than your maaser, more than your 10%, absolutely give it to the causes. But if you're only giving your 10%, then halacha dictates where it goes first. And where it goes first is to the particularistic. The ideal absolutely and categorically should be both. And certainly, halacha expects a level of decency. So even if your priority is on the particular and the close to home, there has to be a decent behavior to society as a whole. If one is living a wonderful life of the particular, and on a global level, one is ignoring global needs and allowing people, to go hungry or sneering negative comments about those who aren't members of our own people, Jews and things like that. Of course, that's terrible, no doubt. The question, though, is in terms of the positive investment of energy. If one is going to stick to in limited resources, which one comes first? And the Torah answer to the question is that people who are nice and loving to those close to home, more often than not, end up also being decent in terms of global values, even if not great, even if they're only giving 3%, but they're giving that 3% to global lead. Whereas people that just focus on the global often end up not being nice to those who are close to home. So it's the lesser of the two in a world of limited resources. That's all it's about. But this is, again, I want to reiterate, this is not meant to be an either-or discussion. Definitely not. We should have the particularistic and the universalistic, absolutely. But where are we going to invest our resources first? That which is close to home.
Okay, I'm with you. I'm personally not opposed to that idea. Call that controversial, I don't know, but like I think I agree with that. I think it starts at home. I think I pretty much agree with the point of view that I think you were relaying.
Thank you. Okay, I'm conscious it's late, so maybe we'll stop there. We're at we've gone quite well over time. So for a Zoom meeting, going for more than an hour of concentration is probably pretty good. So I wish you all a good evening.
That was outstanding. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ollie.
And thank you to Marco for arranging this. Very much appreciated.
No, thanks to Rabbi Zobin, always for his wisdom and his patience and his time, and thanks to.
We've lost you. You've gone mute at the crucial point.
I was just thanking every single person individually. No, I was saying thank you to you, Rabbi, for your time, patience, wisdom every other week. And Ollie, thanks so much for helping me organise this and for the idea for tonight.
One sec. And thank you to David Taman for introducing me to Rabbi Zobin, who I then introduced Marco to Rabbi Zobin.
Thank you for David Taman's mother for meeting my mother and introducing us as friends.
Don't forget Nana Rita. All right. Okay, thanks, guys.
Rabbi, thank you so much.
Okay, good night. A pleasure. Absolute pleasure. Bye.